Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Maccabees in our continuing study of the history of civilization. We left off with Alexander the Great. As he lies on his deathbed, his generals gather around him and ask him, since he's just conquered the world, "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" And he whispers out, "To the strongest." And that guarantees that his kingdom is going to fly apart as all of the various generals each try to grab a piece of the pie. One of those generals, by the name of Ptolemy, in fact, some people think that maybe he was the half-brother of Alexander himself, Ptolemy, and he's known as Ptolemy the Savior, Ptolemy Soter, he grabs Egypt. And so he's a general to Alexander. He grabs a hold of Egypt, knowing that Egypt is got the reputation for being the breadbasket of the world, and he takes the body of Alexander. It's actually on its way back to Macedon, and he diverts the caravan, the procession, and brings it down to Egypt. And he's going to bury Alexander in Egypt, which will give Ptolemy himself quite a bit of prestige. And so we have Ptolemy in Egypt. We have some of the other generals, Perdiccas and Antigonus and Lysimachus and Cassander, and that's just a few of them that are all vying for the kingdom. But Ptolemy is not trying to get everything else. He's just trying to hold on to Egypt. His capital is there in Alexandria, and he's brought the body of Alexander to be buried in Alexandria. Perdiccas moves against him, and there's a battle that's fought, and Perdiccas fails, and that's the last time we're going to hear of him. Next, what's going to happen is that Cassander and Lysimachus and Ptolemy, and probably others as well, are going to team up against Antigonus, and Antigonus is going to suffer defeat, and he's going to be gone as well. So it's the field is narrowing down. One of the generals of Ptolemy, will be Seleucus. And Seleucus is going to initially go up in Ptolemy's name, but he's going to grab a hold of Mesopotamia and Anatolia, and he's going to hold on to it for himself. So he's now going to be one of the players. In fact, our attention now is going to be drawn to Seleucus and Ptolemy as the big players on the game. Cassander and Lysimachus, they're going to be there, but they're going to move sort of in the background. Ptolemy's son, and all of the kings from now on in Egypt, they're going to be Greek kings, but they'll all be named Ptolemy, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, all the way down to the 12th. He is going to reign after the death of his father, and he's renowned for building the Pharos lighthouse. It's going to be considered one of the great wonders of the world, this lighthouse whose light can be seen from, it's reputed, 50 miles away, maybe on a dark night. He also constructs a library at Alexandria that will be the envy of everyone. It will be another great wonder of the world, the greatest library on earth. And of course, he's got the advantage of having it in Egypt, where they produce papyri, and that's necessary for making books, at least in that day and age. And so it's going to become a great library. It will be at this library that they will collect every book in the world. In fact, it is said that they would, any ship coming into the harbor of Alexandria would be searched for books, and if a book was found, they would take it, they would copy the book, and give the copy back to that ship, and keep the original at the Library of Alexandria. One of the books that they decide to copy is the Hebrew Bible, but the problem is that the folks in Egypt can't read Hebrew, and so it's copied, but it's translated into Greek. Tradition has it that there are 70 translators, and so it becomes known as the 70, that is the way you say that in Greek, the Septuagint, and that becomes the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Ptolemy ends up, and so do his descendants. In fact, the history of the next 150 years is a history of warfare between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and sometimes they're at peace, but more often than not, they're at war. Eventually we see one of the kings, one of the Seleucid kings. His name is Antiochus, and there's been a few of them now, Antiochus III. and he marches all the way to India, and so he's really, sometimes we refer to him as Antiochus the Great, because he's in some respects reproducing the conquest of Alexandria. And going to India, he gets Indian elephants, and he takes Judah, the country of Judah, in Canaan, little place where the Jews are living. He takes that from Ptolemy, and Judah's passed hands so many times they probably feel like they're in a ping pong tournament at this point between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, but Antiochus manages to take Judah and hold on to it. And yet, when he tries to invade Egypt, he loses to Ptolemy at the Battle of Raphia, and so this balance of powers, at least for the time being, continues. He also becomes host to Hannibal, who has fought against the Romans, but then was defeated at the Battle of Zama. And we're going to get to the Romans yet in a bit. So we'll come back and talk about the Romans, but they're already playing a part in history, and so we'll be playing catch-up for them. But he plays host to Hannibal, and as a result, finds himself in conflict with Rome. And he fights a battle with Rome, and he loses. And as a result of this loss, he has to send his son as a hostage to Rome. So that brings us to his son, Antiochus IV. Antiochus likes to call himself Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus the Magnificent. Later on, he's going to get a different nickname at the hand of the Jews. They're going to call him Antiochus Epimanes, that is, Antiochus the man who's outside of him, in other words, the madman, the man who's lost his mind. So Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, he becomes a hostage in Rome, and when I say hostage, that doesn't mean he's in a prison cell or anything like that. He's going to school. You can sort of see him as an exchange student. He's got a roommate, and he's taking courses, and he's growing up until his father dies. And when his father dies, he escapes now, and he makes his way back home to Seleucia. And once he's established there, he decides, I'm going to be another Alexander, like my father set out to be. And I have to start the way Alexander did. Alexander, after he had captured Anatolia, he goes down to Egypt, and so he campaigns against Egypt. And he's winning very big in Egypt. And in fact, he's got the king of Egypt, the Greek king of Egypt, the Ptolemy, who's ruling there, is bottled up in the city of Alexandria. And he's winning big when out of the city comes, remember I said he had been a hostage in Rome. He'd actually had a college roommate, a college friend in Rome, and out comes this old college friend from Rome. But now he's no longer a college friend. Now he's a Roman magistrate who comes up to Antiochus, and he says, Rome wants you out of Egypt. Go home. And he says, well, I'll think about it. I'll give it some consideration, and as soon as you leave, I'll do what I want to do. And this magistrate takes a little swagger stick and draws a circle on the sand, saying, you can think about it all you want, but you give me your answer before you step out of that circle. And Antiochus has been to Rome, and he's seen how strong and how committed the Romans can be, and he doesn't want to get into a war with Rome. And so he says, okay, I will leave Egypt. And he does. Faced with this question, with this challenge from a Roman magistrate, he packs up his army, and he leaves, and he heads back home. Now Antiochus is headed back home, and meanwhile, back at Jerusalem, some rumors have reached Jerusalem. You know how you go on Facebook or some sort of social media, and sometimes you hear stories, and sometimes you hear stories they're not true. This whole idea of false news. Well, Antiochus, the news has reached Jerusalem that Antiochus has died in Egypt, and he hasn't died, and he comes to Jerusalem very much alive, and he finds Jerusalem in revolt. And he is frustrated, and he's been embarrassed, and he wants to take this out on somebody, and the Jews are here. And so he comes into Jerusalem. And he takes Jerusalem by storm, and he imposes the following regulations. He says, you guys have been Jewish, and that's the problem. He says, no more assembly for prayer. The Jews cannot observe the Sabbath. That is now forbidden. Possession of the scriptures is illegal. Circumcision is illegal. And these things are all punishable by death. Dietary laws are illegal. And we're going to make good Greeks out of all of you. And so pagan sacrifices are now mandated. And everyone is required to show up, both in Jerusalem and in other places, and offer a sacrifice to Zeus. Of course, nobody knows what Zeus looked like, so they put a big statue of Zeus. Well, what does Zeus look like? They put a statue, and they make the face look like Antiochus himself. And everyone has to bow down to this image. And those that do not, and there's a story told about a mother who has 7 sons, and each one of them is taken and put to death and tortured terribly, and finally she has killed herself as the Jewish people refuse to bow down and worship to this pagan idol. Finally, the soldiers and by the way, by this time Antiochus has gone back home, but he's left his soldiers behind, and they're going to all the little villages, and they come to this little village of Modin to the north of Jerusalem, about 20 miles north of Jerusalem, and there's an old priest there by the name of Matthias. He lives there with his 5 sons, and the soldiers come and say, "Here you have to sacrifice to Zeus," and he refuses, and they go to arrest him, and a fight breaks out, and he kills one of them, and they go to take him, and his sons jump into the fray, and a revolt has now escalated. It's going to be the Maccabean revolt. Named the Maccabean revolt, named after one of the sons of Matthias. It's not his oldest son, it's actually the middle son, Judas, who becomes the leader of this revolt, and he gets the nickname Judas Maccabeus, Judas the Hammer, because he really hammers those Seleucid Greeks. The revolt breaks out, and after 3.5 years of fighting, they manage to recapture the temple, and they come into the temple, they restore the temple sacrifices, because remember, this is a priestly family. And to this day, the Jewish people still remember that liberation of the temple, that cleansing of the temple, and they celebrate it every year at the Feast of Dedication, the way you say that in Hebrew, the Feast of Hanukkah. And that is a celebration to this day commemorated by the Jewish people, remembering their independence and their freedom to worship the Lord as he has mandated. Well, Antiochus, he had come on the heels of Alexander's generals, and I'm summarizing this because this is actually given by way of prophecy in the book of Daniel. Daniel describes one who would come on the heels of Alexander's generals and who would magnify himself against the Jews and against their God, and who would put a stop to the sacrificial system and make alterations to the laws, who would attempt to overturn the truth of the scriptures. And all those things were promised in Daniel chapter 11. In fact, they were so exactly fulfilled that a great many scholars who don't believe in prophecy, they can't deny that. So they maintain, well, Daniel, that part of Daniel must have been written after the event, because it was so completely fulfilled that this one who had power over the nation of Israel would ultimately be defeated. And yet it happened just the way Daniel prophesied. And we have very old copies of the book of Daniel that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that I think give evidence to the fact that Daniel predated these events, that it was indeed prophecy. The prophecy went on to talk about how the sway of this ruler, his sway over the temple, would endure for approximately for 2,300 mornings and evenings. It's rounded off around 3.5 years, where there would be this great time of tribulation, and yet ultimately the holy place would be properly restored. And the book of Daniel refers to this as the abomination of desolation, and it took place just the way the book of Daniel described. Now, as I said, Judas now is going to become the leader, and he dies eventually, still fighting against the Seleucids, but then Simon becomes the new leader, so it goes from Judas to Simon. He's the older brother. And Judah finally is recognized by Rome as a free state. Rome's recognition is in, I think, 145, but by 142, the Seleucids have gone home. They haven't been able to overcome the Jewish people, and Judah is now a free state and is being ruled by Simon and eventually by his children. So Simon is the high priest. They don't have a king at this point. They just have a high priest. But Simon is murdered by his son-in-law. And so after Simon is murdered, we now have, he's got three sons, Judah, John Hyrcanus, and I guess we could say Matthias Jr. But John Hyrcanus now becomes the leader. He's, remember, the high priest. And it's under him that Samaria and Galilee and Idumea now are conquered, and they actually become now part of what we could call a restored Israel. Because you can't call it Judah anymore. Judah is just that part that used to belong to the kingdom of Judah, and so Judah's gotten bigger, and now it's Samaria and also Idumea, the Edomites. And not only does he conquer them, but he says, you are all now going to be Jewish, and so he forces their conversion, and that's going to have an impact upon later history, where he forces them to be circumcised and to be Jewish. And they don't necessarily think of themselves as Jewish. During this time, we have two new Jewish parties emerging. Neither one of them will be encompass all of the Jewish people. They will both be relative minorities. First, there is the Hasidim, the pious ones, and they will eventually give way and be superseded by the Pharisees, but also sort of in the same theological family. So we're going to have the Pharisees. Then the word Pharisee just means the separated ones. And by the time we get to the New Testament, we see the Pharisees as one of the groups. It's a minority group, but they have a great popularity among the people, and especially within the synagogue. Meanwhile, the other group are the Hellenists. They show a certain amount of Greek influence, and sometimes we think of the Sadducees as being part of that, but not really. The Sadducees are going to be a separate group. And the Sadducees are going to envision themselves as the sort of the old school, the ones who have just the law and just go back to the basics. So they don't really see themselves as Hellenists, although for us, sometimes from the outside looking in, that's the way they appear. Because, for example, they deny this idea of resurrection and angels and supernatural. And that sounds a lot like Hellenists, but it's not. They really are two different groups. So John Hyrcanus now, he has two sons, Aristobulus and Alexander. And Aristobulus becomes both the high priest and king, and he imprisons his mother and his brothers because he doesn't want any competition. And that's almost starting to sound like the Greek way of doing things, where a Greek king would come to the throne and he'd get rid of all the possible competition. And we see Jewish people acting like that, and that's sad. It really is. Well, Aristobulus eventually dies, and his wife, Salome Alexandria, Alexander is going to now become the new king because his brother has died. And so she marries him, and they're going to have two sons themselves. And they are going to be Hyrcanus. Of course, there's already been Hyrcanus earlier, so we're going to call him Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. And then her husband, Alexander, dies. And after that, the boys are still sort of young. And so Salome Alexandria, she actually becomes the ruler. She can't be high priest. High priest has to be a man. But she becomes the ruler now over Israel. And for a number of years, Israel is ruled by a woman, by a queen, Salome Alexandria. And she really does quite well. Things actually go well during her reign. Finally, what's happened, and meanwhile, and we're going to get to Rome eventually, but that's all taking place at the same time. There's a Roman general by the name of Pompey the Great. And Pompey has been commissioned to clear the seas of piracy, and to that end, they give him a 5-year commission, and he accomplishes it in about 3 months. And then he takes that commission and he continues on to Syria, and he's conquering in Syria, and he's doing very well in Syria when Salome by this time has died, and her two sons are arguing. They're fighting as to who's going to be high priest and who's going to be king, and they're fighting between each other. And they each send word to Pompey, can you come and get rid of this brother of mine? And he says, okay, and he comes down to Jerusalem, and he conquers Jerusalem. And he goes into the temple. In fact, he walks into the Holy of Holies, because he's curious to see what kind of God they worship. You go into most temples, there's a statue of a god. And he goes into the temple in Jerusalem, and there's nothing there. Remember how back in Old Testament times there'd been the Ark of the Covenant. That was long since lost. That never came back to the temple after the destruction of the temple, back in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. And so he goes in, and there's nothing there. And he comes back out. And now he is going to take the land of Israel, and he's going to break it up into parts. And he's going to make some territorial arrangements. And initially he does allow one of the brothers to be high priest and the other one to be well, not king, but sort of localized governor. But that doesn't last, and one brother bites off the other brother's ears. It's really sort of nasty. And what he does, he takes a Idumean. Remember how the Idumeans had been forcibly converted? And he makes an Idumean into the overseer, and he's going to break this up into where we're going to have Judea, and we'll have the Decapolis, that is the 10 Greek cities, and we'll have Samaria, and eventually we'll also have Galilee as well. And these are going to be the divisions by which we refer to, there won't be any more Israel. Now there will be these 4 designations, these 4 territories, and they're going to be Roman territories. And he takes an Idumean prince by the name of Antipater, and he makes Antipater procurator. Now that's a new title we haven't heard. That's not a king, it's not a governor. A procurator, his main job is to procure the taxes for Rome. And so his job is going to be procurator, and Antipater eventually takes his 2 sons and puts them in charge, one in charge of Judah, that's Faisal, and that's the older son, and the other younger son in charge of Galilee, and his name will be Herod. We're going to get to know him in the Bible. He'll be the one we call Herod the Great. But right now he's just Herod the young guy, and he's governor of Galilee. When Antipater dies, the Jewish people are going to revolt against him, and actually they will enlist the aid of the Parthians to the east, who will come and invade and assist in the routing and the capture of Faisal, that older son of Antipater. They'll also try to capture, Faisal will be put to death. They'll try to capture Herod, but Herod's going to escape, make his way to Egypt, and from there to Rome. Herod is going to come to Rome, and he'll stand before the Senate and plead his case, and given the sponsorship of Mark Antony, the Senate's going to declare Herod to be the king of the Jews, and they will send him back to recapture that kingdom. He'll be given some Roman soldiers to go in, and will recapture Israel and bring it back under the sway of Rome. But now he will reign. They make that announcement in 40, but it's going to take a couple of 2 or 3 years for him to get back, recapture it, and then will reign until the year 4 BC. As king of the Jews, Herod's going to undergo a number of big building projects. One of them is the temple complex. The temple had been rebuilt in the days of Zerubbabel. It had been a fairly small affair. There had been gates around it and things like that. But now that had been added first by the Seleucids and then by the Hasmoneans. It had seen a number of expansions. In the days of Herod, that's expanded greatly, as there are porches and stoas and fortresses built all around as part of this very large temple complex. On the north side of the temple complex would be built the Antonia fortress, named for his benefactor, Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony. This Antonia fortress is going to overlook the temple. Here's a model that's actually it's in Jerusalem today, and it looks to what Herod made for that temple complex. You can see the Antonia fortress with the 4 giant towers overlooking the temple complex and overlooking the temple itself. A great many of the activities of the New Testament are going to take place here in the temple, and even in that Antonia fortress. We're going to see the Apostle Paul being taken to that place when he is arrested. This temple complex then is much bigger. This is considered to be the greatest temple assembly area in the world. He's going to have that big court of the Gentiles. It will be elaborately built, and then the temple proper, it will be completely rebuilt to house and to make the temple now one of the wonders of the world. He will also make a series of fortifications. One of them is here at the Herodium. Notice the sort of swimming pool. There's no water in it now, but there was back then. And this is actually it's just south of Bethlehem. When you're standing in Bethlehem, you can look south and see the Herodium. It looks like a volcano, but actually there was a big fortress atop it. That is man-made, and this shows an artist's conception of what the fortress looked like back in that day, with towers all around. A number of years ago, one of my students happened to be at the Herodium when they found pieces of a sarcophagus. Here is showing as they've tried to reassemble that sarcophagus. He was there when they were just pulling out pieces. He sent me back pictures of it. I was so delighted to get that. And they now believe that this was the sarcophagus of Herod the Great. Very elaborately done, and yet later on the Jews revolted and they took that sarcophagus and smashed it apart and probably destroyed the body that was within. Herod went on to make other things. Israel has no natural harbors, and so he built a man-made harbor with a man-made breakwater at Caesarea, right on the coast. He names it after the Caesars because they are his patrons. You can go to Caesarea today. There were no springs there, no natural water, and so he had water piped in via these very long aqueducts, bringing water from 9 to 15 miles away from the mountains down to by the shore. To show what kind of pomp and ceremony and power that he had, some of these aqueducts actually supplied water to a swimming pool. You say, what's the big deal about a swimming pool? This wasn't a saltwater pool. This was a freshwater pool with water that was piped in from miles and miles away to show how powerful was this king of the Jews. There is a stadium that he built, a theater that he built, that's still being used for concerts to this day, 2,000 years later. He also had a hippodrome, that is a big stadium for horse races, for chariot races, and you can still go to the hippodrome today. They're not doing any chariot races today, and yet that was part of the city that he built. Now, Herod had some domestic troubles. He had a number of wives, but his favorite wife was Mariamne, the last surviving remnant of the Maccabees, of the Hasmoneans, the house of Hasmonean, and he made the mistake of falling in love with her. And he began to uncover plots that were aimed at putting him to death and putting his two sons by Mariamne on the throne in his place. And so he murdered not just those two, plus Mariamne, he put her to death, and those two sons plus another son. So many sons that he put to death that Octavius Augustus, the Roman emperor, quipped that it's better to be Herod's hus than to be Herod's huios. The word huios is his son. The word hus is pig. It's better to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son, because Herod had killed a number of his sons, but he wouldn't touch pork, he wouldn't touch pig, because remember he was observing the dietary laws. It's the same Herod the Great that right at the end of his life, he has a number of magi. Sometimes we think 3, but no, we're not told how many they were. These magi from the east that were from Parthia. Remember, the Parthians had come and had helped with this revolt, and these magi come from the east asking, where is the one who's born King of the Jews? And of course this introduces the New Testament story, because it was Jesus who had been born King of the Jews. And that same Herod who had been willing to put his own sons to death seeks also to put this newborn son, not of his, but this newborn son to death, and yet fails. And that will bring us to another story.